Hello, friends. This is Gabriel. Welcome to Exploring the Qur'an and the Bible. I'm in my office here at the University of Notre Dame. In this episode, I speak with Professor Rita George-Tvrtkovic, a remarkable scholar of Islam and Christianity, who's written this book on Mary in Islam and Christianity. We will focus on Mary in the Qur'an. You're going to discover all sorts of intriguing things. For example, there's an entire chapter of the Qur'an named after Mary, chapter 19, or Surah Maryam. And you're going to discover that Mary is considered by some Muslims, not the majority, but some, as a prophet. Why? How could that be? How can Mary be a prophet? And why do those who reject that claim reject it? It's a really interesting discussion. So thank you so much for joining. While you're here, please take a moment to subscribe, to hit that bell button once you subscribe so you're notified of new content, and to like this video. That will be a great help for me and encouragement to continue producing interesting content about the Quran and the Bible. Thank you so much. Hello, Professor George-Tvrtkovic. Happy to be with you here.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for taking some time to share your wisdom. We're going to speak today about the place of Mary in Islam, in the Quran especially, but we'll start with sort of contextualizing that or setting a foundation for that by speaking about Mary in the Bible and in early Christianity. This is one of your specializations, or one of the focuses of your research. So I'll give a brief introduction so people can get to know you better, and then we'll get right into the topic of Mary. Sound okay?
Sounds great.
Wonderful. Okay, so everyone, friends, Rita George-Tvrtkovic received her Ph.D. from the University of Notre Dame, which is just a wonderful place to do that. She is professor of theology at Benedictine University in suburban Chicago, where she specializes in medieval Christian-Muslim relations and contemporary interreligious dialogue. Her books include A Christian Pilgrim in Medieval Iraq, Ricardo de Montecroce's Encounter with Islam, and, stay right there, this book. Well, I think the lighting in my office is not too easy to see. Christian Muslims and Mary, A History, which was published with Paulist Press, maybe about 2017. I guess I can look. 2018. Okay, great. Yeah, wonderful book. So please buy this. She is a former associate director of the Archdiocese of Chicago's Office for Ecumenical and Interreligious Dialogue, Interreligious Affairs. And very exciting, she was recently appointed by Pope Francis to be consultant for the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. So it sounds okay as a bio? Did I get the main points?
Sounds great, yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's turn right to Mary, and let's speak a little bit first about Mary in the Bible. And I want to sort of start there, because many of our viewers will know that, especially for Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians, Mary is just like super important, right? Like, is at the center of devotional life, but also is important to the larger theological system of Christianity. And yet, I mean, what do we actually find in the New Testament about Mary? Can we start there?
Yes, for theology, we should always start there. So let's start with the New Testament. And the short answer to your question is simply, there's not much there. If you look at what is said about Mary, there's nothing at all about her own birth, her own childhood. For the Gospels that talk about the Nativity of Jesus, so that's Matthew and Luke, we see Mary in Matthew as the betrothed to Joseph, who discovers that she is with child, right? That's Matthew. And then, of course, Luke, we have the great Annunciation story. We also have Mary praying the Magnificat. We also have Mary Mary and Joseph talking to the young Jesus in the temple when he's 12. Okay, so that's sort of the first, but of course, Mark and John don't have anything to say about that Mary, because they don't have anything to say about young Jesus. Right. Then we move to sort of the middle life of Jesus, Gospel of John, chapter 2. We already have the wedding at Cana, so we have Mary and Jesus talking about that first miracle. And then the third sort of cluster of discussion of Mary is before and after the death and resurrection of Christ. So, of course, in John, we have her at the foot of the cross. But even in Acts of the Apostles, right, by Luke, we have Mary right after the Ascension, listed as among the first followers of Christ in the cenacle. So, but that's very, very little. We have to look to the extra scriptural literature, such as the Proto-Evangelion of James for more details about Mary's life and her biography.
Right. Yeah. Great. And it's been pointed out, I think, that I'd never actually tried to measure this, but there's a significant amount of material on Mary in the Qur'an, maybe more than the New Testament. I'm not sure. It's probably close. But definitely in the Qur'an, we find something about Mary's birth and nativity and upbringing, which we don't have at all in the New Testament. So interesting contrast.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to get at sort of the transition. I'm not sure if that's the right term, because that might presume something about the historical development of Marian devotion. But just the fact that we have a modest amount of material, at least in terms of quantity, in the Bible on Mary, and then the great flowering of devotion to Mary in the early church. So could you speak about that? Like, how does that come to be? Why does Mary become so important to the early church?
Yes. So I'd like to quote another of my Notre Dame professors, Brian Daly, who made the point that, Mariology and Christology are always linked. You can't have the one without the other. So discussions or Christological controversies really come to a head right in the 5th century. Think of the Council of Ephesus and, of course, the Great Council of Chalcedon, when Christians are debating the nature of Christ and who he is. So it makes sense that arguments and discussions about the nature of Christ are connected to arguments and discussions about the nature of Mary. So at the Council of Ephesus, 431, we have this great debate with Christians. Is she Theotokos, God-bearer? Is she Christotokos, Christ-bearer? And actually, this is one of the first divisions within Christians as we argue about this. So those go hand in hand. And then at Chalcedon, when sort of a lot, not all, but a lot of the Christological controversies are sort of settled, we see a flourishing and a flowering of Marian devotion. That's sort of the traditional view. But other scholars like Stephen Shoemaker say, now, wait a minute, we can actually see some prayers, some devotions at the popular level a few decades before these councils and even into the previous century. So that, again, have we privileged doctrine over praxis? There's the famous saying, lex orandi, lex credendi, the law of prayer is the law of belief. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, the devotion of the people or the doctrine? So again, 5th century is the locus classicus, but we could talk about devotions before that.
So maybe we could say a little bit about the councils of Ephesus, which I think is 431, and
Yes.
Chalcedon, which is 451, and the place of Mary therein. I don't know if this is going to be super interesting to all of our viewers, but in some ways it sets the scene for the Qur'an's engagement with Mary.
Yes.
I don't know. I tend to think that, of course, this is sort of a outsider's perspective, but if the Qur'an was going to engage with the religious context of its time, it had to engage with Mary. It had to say something about Mary because Mary became so important, in particular after Ephesus and Chalcedon. So you mentioned there that sort of the key phrase or title was Theotokos, or Theotokos, sometimes people pronounce it probably incorrectly, which means God-bearer, or sometimes rendered as Mother of God. And this became a dispute, I think, between Cyril of Alexandria, who was cool with that term. He was like, yes, we can speak of Mary as Mother of God. And Nestorius, Bishop in Constantinople, who was like, no. But I wonder, what was really at stake there, and why was there a division over this? What was the problem for Nestorius, or what was the importance to this term for Cyril?
Yeah. So again, Christological controversy. How do we hold together the central paradox of the Christian faith, right? Which is, in Christ, we believe 2 natures, 1 person. How does that hang together? And so with Theotokos, I think they were trying to stress the unity of that person, but always to say that she's the bearer of God, the second person of the Trinity, not God the Father. And I think the Nestorians were probably they were concerned about the distinction, right, as in creator and the rest of us. So they're concerned about the distinction. And so The Nestorian Church, which is sort of the derogatory term that was really not used now. This is the contemporary Assyrian Church of the East, right? This produces the first split in the church. I mean, this is a real, or one of the first splits in the church. This is a real contentious discussion about the nature of who is Christ. But what's interesting, to give you maybe to give us a happy ending, fast forward to 1994. The Roman Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church of the East sign a common Christological declaration where they try to clarify, they basically say, well, we're really saying the same thing theologically. And by the way, we're both allowed to use these diverse theological expressions today. Right. So before, right, you'd say, no, you have to choose between Theotokos and Christotokos. And today they say, no, there's a diversity of expressions, but really underneath we mean the same thing. So I think that's a nice happy ending to the rancor of the 5th century.
Yes. Yeah, there's a principle in Islam of ikhtilaf, of the legitimacy of difference, sometimes in jurisprudential matters in particular. But yeah, Christians could maybe learn from Muslims on that openness, the difference, the ikhtilaf. Okay, and then I want to get to the Quran. But I'd like to sort of take a detour before we get to the Quran itself, as a way of illustrating that maybe to people who don't know this, that Mary really is important to Islam. Maybe some of our non-Muslim viewers won't realize that Mary has a place at all in Islam. And I mean, the really intriguing thing, and something that you address in your book, is that there is not only interest in Mary, but there's devotion to Mary in the Islamic world. So could you point out an example or two of where Muslims, maybe together with Christians, have shown or continue to show devotion to Mary?
Yeah, I'd like to highlight the line from the Catholic, conciliar document Nostra Aetate 3, in its list of sort of shared items, between Catholic Christians and Muslims, is this idea of they call on Mary with devotion. And I would just like to say that in both religions, both Islam and Christianity, there is some intra-religious debate about devotion, right? So while Catholics and Orthodox Christians might have devotion to Mary, and Protestant, part of the Protestant Reformation was to critique that, right? So Christians disagree. Likewise, Muslims do. Some Muslim scholars will say you can invoke no one but God, right? And so but yet at the popular level, as you said, Professor Reynolds, there is a tremendous amount of devotion. I'm just going to, kind of give you some examples of places. And interestingly, traditionally, the places that Muslims go to express their devotion to Mary is Christian shrines to Mary. So we have a very old one, is Our Lady of Sednaya in Syria, which luckily, as far as I know, has been preserved from being destroyed during the Civil War.
Right.
And Christians have been going, and Christians have been going there since the 6th century, and Muslims have been going at least since the medieval period. We actually have in the Cantigas de Santa Maria, 13th century Iberia, talking about Our Lady of Sardone. So in medieval text, Sardone is Sednaya. Wow. So we have medieval accounts of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, by the way, going to Sardone, Sednaya, for the healing oil. And I actually have a medieval image of the icon, and you can see it's oozing oil, and then there's a little basin. And so Christians, Muslims, and Jews went there. So that's an ancient site of devotion. We have more contemporary ones that have been founded in the 19th century and the 20th century, but very popular. Notre Dame, another Notre Dame d'Afrique in Algeria, was sort of built up by the White Fathers in North Africa. And even though Algeria, of course, has a very tiny Christian minority today, post-colonialism, Muslims stream to Our Lady of Africa. We have Harissa in Lebanon, of course. We have also from the 19th century, Mariamabad in Pakistan. And I just met with the Archbishop of Lahore, who confirmed with me that Muslims go there, Christians go there, Hindus go there, Sikhs go there. It's a pilgrimage point. in his diocese. And then also, for example, an Armenian church in Baghdad has been since the, I think, 17th century. So there are a lot of examples of this. And then I would also add one, I think a recent phenomenon that I find very intriguing, that in the past 2 decades, I would say, Muslims, more and more Muslims throughout the world have begun naming mosques Mariam with the express purpose, like explicitly, the explicit purpose of interreligious dialogue. There's one in Hoppers Crossing, Australia. There's one called Al Saidia in Tartus, Syria. There's one in Abu Dhabi called Mosque Mariam that in 2017 was renamed Mosque Mariam. It was named something else before. And then there's Ahmadiyya Mosque in Galway, Ireland. So I think this is very interesting that instead of Muslims just visiting Mary, so that's kind of a new expression, in my view, of Muslim devotion.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I had an experience when I was in Harissa in Lebanon with Iranian friends. This was one of the places they wanted to see in Lebanon. I was living there at the time. They came to visit and said, we want to go to Harissa to visit, the shrine to Mary. And it's also the place where the telepherique, like the gondola, goes up on the cable car up the mountain. And you have many, many tourists, especially from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, who will go up for the cable car, but then they'll find themselves at the top at the shrine to Mary. And so you see a lot of mixture there between Catholic pilgrims and Muslims. Okay, so let's circle back then to the Quran to see why there is, in fact, sort of like grounding or a principle which allows Muslims to develop devotion to Mary, because, in fact, she's very prominent in the Quran. What are some of the things we should know about Mary in the Quran?
The number one thing that the Quran tells us about Mary is that she's chosen by God. In 342, it says, God has chosen you and made you pure, and also that she is chosen above all women.
That's very.
And again, we can see the parallels with the Christian scripture and what the angel says to her in the Annunciation. So that's really important. She is special, blessed, and chosen. But and other things. She is, of course, a virgin mother. She's exceptional. Another parallel. She's an example for the believers. She's obedient. She has faith. She is devout. She prays. She is silent. She trusts in divine providence. She questions. And I love this. She has courage. In Surah 19, when the angel first comes, she basically says, go away. She's willing to challenge, asks questions, etc. She's protected from Satan. So all these special things about Mary, and yet she's human, which I think the Quran stresses more than the Bible, right? So in Surah 19, she gives birth alone, and she's basically tells us what a pain it is. I mean, it's a real, description of actual childbirth, okay, and how the mother might feel, versus in the Bible, there's no sense of that whatsoever. And so I really like that aspect of the Quranic Mary, actually.
It's interesting. So you began with that quotation from Surah Al-Imran, Surah 3, about Mary being chosen above all women. And my guess is, but you could confirm or correct this, that most of the Mufassirun explain, well, she is chosen above all women in as much as she had the miracle of a virgin birth of Jesus. But principally it's that. And I think there's some hadith out there which mention other women who are also chosen above all women, including Fatima and maybe Aisha, maybe wife of Pharaoh or the mother of Moses.
Yeah.
So, but it seems that the Quran, although it may not be sort of compelling or conclusive proof, but it seems that the Quran means more than just the fact that she gave birth to Jesus without knowing a man. Because it mentions these other qualities, as you say, like I think qanita, obedient, or soft-hearted towards God. I think she's called Siddiqa, meaning that she believes or trusts in God. So she has these virtues, right? So she's not only sort of the medium of a miracle of Jesus, but in herself she's special.
Yeah, and I think that's important for both. For both Christians and Muslims today, to take a contemporary rethink and relook at Mary in both traditions. That also, Mary, the biblical Mary, is also worthy of emulation, not just because she's a mother, but because, again, also her courage, the things she speaks about justice in the Magnificat, she's prophetic, right?
Yes.
And so, and it's important, right? Because we could talk about, the Mary meek and mild, that she's submissive, and you could even think of, for example, on the Christian side, the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, very submissive. And you think of, like, in Mexican culture, I don't know if you've heard of this, there's machismo and then there's marianismo, which is like the womanly submission, right? So we follow Mary meek and mild, or do we reclaim those aspects of her that have maybe been ignored? And by the way, she's not just for women, she's a model for men. And that, I think that's interesting, because in my classes, and most of my classes, by the way, at my Catholic university, we have 25% Muslim student population. So I have a lot of Muslims in my classes. And so one time I asked this Muslim in my class, young man in my class, do you see Mary as a model for you? And he said, no. And I think a lot of Catholic men might say the same thing, but I would argue that she's a model. Anyway, all those qualities you mentioned sort of prove to me why she's a model for all of us.
Right. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. So you mentioned in your book that, I don't know how much we want to get into this because we want to get back to the Quran, but nevertheless, I can't resist saying how you mentioned that there are complications with Mary as the central figure in Christian-Muslim dialogue, in part because I think at one point you say, is she a bridge or a barrier? So yeah, I mean, but part of this is there's contention among certain Christians over Mary's role in Christian life, because of the idea that she might represent certain qualities such as mildness or meekness, but not sort of assertiveness or leadership. And so some Catholics have sort of stepped back from Marian devotion. And meanwhile, where does this leave us for Mary as the figure that's going to bridge Muslims and Christians?
Right. I think this is something that we have to talk about, Christians and Muslims, because, for example, I often talk about how, so I live in the city of Chicago, and I live in the city and I commute to a suburb. And so I use the freeways quite a lot. And so there are these billboards by O'Hare Airport that are actually sponsored by the Islamic Circle of North America that try to, like, show the connection between Islam and Christianity. And so one of the billboards had a picture of a woman with hijab, and it said, hijab, the head covering worn by Muslim women, and Mother Mary. So the idea of the Muslims had with that billboard was to say, look, Mary is this bridge between Christians and Muslims. However, right, you have to understand the fact that Christians differ even in the history in terms of how much they love Mary, right? So that billboard might appeal to certain Catholics and certain Orthodox Christians, but a lot of Protestant Christians, don't have a devotion to Mary, right, and that's one of the reasons for the Reformation, right? But and then, as you also said, the new generation of even Catholics, do they say the Rosary? Have they rejected that? So I think there are lots of nuances to making her a bridge if the Muslims don't know their Christian audience and the diversity within Christianity. That's
a really good point. Yeah. Okay. So now circling back to the Quran, I want to bring up two sort of interesting topics. One, I think, which is a little difficult, but we'll start with what I think is the easier one. As we mentioned before, the Quran speaks about the birth and nativity, or the birth and the upbringing of Mary. So super interesting. We're speaking now about Surah 3. Now, of course, we've mentioned already Surah 19, which is a surah named after Mary, Maryam. And of course, Mary is the only woman referred to by name in the Quran. So she has all these distinctions, but also there's this distinction in that we have a scene in which the mother of Mary appears in the Quran. Now, Christians would know, hope I'm not saying too much. I'll give you space to take over in a second. Christians would know her as Saint Anne. In the Quran, she's referred to as the wife of Imran. And so she says in verse 35, I'll just read the Arabic and then the English of Surah 3. إذ قالت امرأة عمران ربي أني نذرت لك ما في بطني محررا فتقبل مني إنك أنت السميع العليم. The wife of Imran said, My Lord, I have vowed what is in my womb to you, dedicated, so accept it from me. You are the hearer and the knower. Now, I think there's a Christian subtext to this, so maybe I'll just ask if you could tell us a little bit like what's going on in Surah 3 here.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and again, it's interesting to think about connections between this and the Proto-Evangelion of James, but theologically, there's a lot of extraordinary things happening here. And you can think of parallel, for example, when you talk about the baby being dedicated in the womb, if you're a Christian or a Jew for that matter, you hear echoes of the Old Testament. You think of the prophet Jeremiah, before you were born, I knew you, I dedicated you as a prophet to the nation. So again, there's like interesting parallels there in terms of the importance of this child, possibly prophetic, etc., dedicated in the womb. Also interesting, right? Her mother names her and sort of, makes this statement of, surprise, it's not a boy, but it's a girl and that's okay. I think that's an important sort of element.
Yes.
But then, of course, the last bit in 36, that she prays for her protection from Satan, Mary, and Jesus. And this is really important, actually, for Christians, for Catholic Christians, in the later medieval and early modern period, because they find this verse through Bukhari and through Hadith. They find this idea that that Islam says that Mary and Jesus are not touched by Satan. And these Christian theologians who at this time are arguing about the Immaculate Conception say, look, even the Qur'an, it's Bukhari, but even the Qur'an says, agrees with us. They're arguing against Catholics. This is an intra-Catholic argument. So I find that aspect, right? Of course, Muslims say we don't have a doctrine of Immaculate Conception, but Catholics saw that in there. And there's even paintings, by the way. I don't know if you know about this, Professor Reynolds. In Split, Croatia, where I go, there's a huge painting. It's sort of like the argument about the Immaculate Conception. You have all the Catholic doctors on both sides, and Muhammad's on one side with the quote from Bukhari, but then, it says Quran. But anyway, so this great. Verse becomes really important.
Can I just, sorry, Rita, forgive me. If I could just mention a little bit more about that quotation, the hadith that's found in the collection of Bukhari. So we have in verse 36, Surah Al-Imran, exactly as you said, where the wife of Imran, or Saint Anne, depending on your perspective, says, I have placed her and her offspring, Duriya, and her offspring, at least from a religious perspective, that's only Jesus, under your protection from Satan, the outcast. The Arabic there is Inni u'idhuha bika wa dhurriyyataha min ash-shaytan ar-rajim. And then this verse seems to give birth to these hadith in which it's said that I think every child at birth is touched by Satan, for which reason it cries, except for Mary and Jesus.
Right. All the children of Adam, I think it even.
All the children of Adam. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Super interesting. Yeah. So now this whole scene of the wife of Imran dedicating her child to God, if we look at the Proto-Evangelium, like where is it taking place? What is sort of like the geographical context?
Well, do you mean of the writing of that, or do you mean
no? I mean, where is Mary and why is her mother, like, what does it mean to dedicate a child to God in that?
Well, it's very interesting. So it's a Jewish context in the sense that, and then the wife of Imran, and then Imran kind of disappears, and then we have who's her protector is Zechariah. So there's a very very interesting, and so he's a priest of the temple
in Jerusalem.
Right. And so where does she, and then again, where does she grow up? In the temple. She's one of the virgins of the temple. She's pure in the temple. And actually in the Proto-Evangelion of James, I think when the angel comes to her, she's like weaving the purple cloth for the temple, so. Wow. So that is, you're right. That's a very important context that sort of undergirds her Jewishness and also her purity, her purity, and also, by the way, that God continues to provide for her, right? So both the Evangelion of James and the Qur'an talk about how Zechariah would come to see the young Mary in her locked room, and she would just have miraculously provisions from God. And again, so this shows she relies on God's providence, right? So of course, all of that background is completely absent from the Christian New Testament, but it's present in the Evangelion of James, and it's present in the Quran.
Yeah. The Quran uses this term mihrab for the chamber in which she is located, which, I mean, it's been debated, but may just be an allusion to the Jerusalem temple. And and that's, from a theological point of view, of course, super interesting to associate Mary with the temple, not only because the temple is a place of sanctity and holiness, but especially because God dwells, or God's Spirit dwells in the temple. There's lots to be said theologically about that. Could you explain the Immaculate Conception in case someone doesn't know that? What does that mean?
Sure.
Sometimes it's thought that this means Jesus was conceived without sin, but
right. And so that's a misconception on Catholics, right? So that is different than the virgin conception and virgin birth. But the Immaculate Conception is a Catholic doctrine, and very recently proclaimed, 1854. Okay, so this is not, but it was debated by Catholics, like I said, intra-Catholic debate. And the idea is for Mary, who's only a human being, let's be clear, good as she is, only a human being, for her to have birthed the second person, right, Jesus, Son of God, she had to be without sin. And the only way to preserve that is if she herself, from original sin, right, is to be preserved from her conception. Okay, so that is the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception that Catholics disagreed about. So, for example, traditionally, Aquinas and the Dominicans were against the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And then we have later, the Franciscans and then Jesuits who tended to be they tended to be the Immaculists versus the Maculists. But by 1854, the Immaculists won out with official dogma of the church. But yes, so Protestant Christians do not subscribe to the Immaculate Conception. Now, Orthodox Christians probably theologically could sign on to it, but as far as I know, Orthodox Christians do not have a formal doctrine. Am I correct about that, Dr. Reynolds?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think Orthodox Christians have an official doctrinal statement the way Catholics do, but they will probably be more sympathetic to it than most Protestants.
Right. Yeah, someone in the comment section might give us an exact reference to Orthodox thought on the Immaculate Conception. So wonderful. Okay, well, I want to get onto one more difficult topic about Mary in the Quran, or one more topic, and this is the difficult one. And then we'll speak a little bit about contemporary conversations around Mary to conclude. So, in some ways, this is like the big question around Mary for Muslim theologians, which is whether she can be considered a prophetess or a prophet. She's not referred to explicitly as a Nabiya, so as a prophet or prophetess in the Quran. But as you note in the book, some Muslim scholars have agreed that she is. Can we just maybe generally approach that topic? What are some of the arguments for or against? Why would anyone even imagine she should be considered a prophet?
Yeah, I think it's important to say that I think for the majority of Muslim scholars throughout history, the answer has been no. And they often point to Surah 16:43, right? All messengers were men. So we'll just bracket that for a second. But there is this minority argument.
Point, sorry, just on that verse. One of the key words in that verse, men, rijal is a key word, but the other is messenger there. It's Rasul, right? So it leaves the possibility of Anbiya open, maybe. Anyway, sorry.
Right, no, that's important, because even among the minority of scholars who say she might be prophet Nabiya, none of them are saying she's Rasulullah. None of them are claiming that she's a messenger. I think that's an important, thank you for that, it's an important distinction. But among those minority scholars who claim she's possibly a prophet, it's interesting as it comes from, like what was happening in medieval Iberia, that we have several of these scholars who are kind of on the same page on this, right, etc. So probably the number one argument is that somehow God communicated wahi, right, revelation to her through an angel. That's the main argument for her prophethood. Other arguments include, she's listed in Surah 21, Anbiya, the prophets. She's introduced like the male prophets, although not with their name. They say, remember, instead of the name, remember the one who guarded her chastity, right? Well, that's Mary. Okay, so that's another argument. Well, she's listed with all the other prophets in that chapter. Other arguments are about her perfection, and perfection equals prophethood. And also this divine notion of divine chosenness that we already talked about. So those are some of the arguments. But for those scholars who say she's not a prophet, and some are very explicit in saying she's not a prophet, like Razi, or they still say, well, she's waliya, friend of God. They say she's Siddiqa, she's righteous. They say she's among the best women. Again, there's always a list of 4, and the names change, like which one is it? Is it Aisha? Is it who is it? But she's usually in that list of 4. A recent argument that I mentioned in my book by a contemporary scholar, Hossein Aboud, she says that Mary should be considered a prophet because she's an important genealogical link in the line of prophets, with Jesus. So that's a very interesting and different argument. So even though most Muslim scholars say she's not a prophet, she's still pretty special. So kind of think about also with Christians, and Catholic, like hyperdulia. Like dulia is devotion for just average saints. Devotion is, worship is for God alone. But Mary's like kind of, she's in the middle. She gets hyperdulia. She gets extra devotion. So I think Muslims are trying to struggle with that same thing too.
Yes. And I think too of the scene in Surah Maryam, where the scene of the Annunciation, we have 2 references to the Annunciation. One is in Al-Imran, I think, verse 45, and then another in Surah Maryam. But in Surah Maryam, the Ruh, so the Spirit, appears to Mary and speaks to her directly. And it says appears to her as a perfect man. And so we get the sense that she hears the Ruh and she sees the Ruh. So, this is the prophetic experience, it seems like. Now, Ruh, is usually understood to be an allusion to Gabriel, but it seems like that would be a pretty strong argument that she receives a direct communication, revelation from God.
Yeah. So again, that's the argument of Al-Qurtubi and Ibn Hazm, but not others.
Okay. Yeah. Great. One of the interesting things for Islamic theology to work out is that you don't have clear authoritative bodies which resolve these disputes. So I've just, in advance of our discussion, I was looking online a bit, and you still find people posting on social media and things, Mary is a prophet, and arguing for this or that of a reason. And she appears also in Surah 66, I think, as an example, along with the wife of Pharaoh, as a pious woman, unlike the wives of Noah and Lot. She's really, really prominent in the Qur'an, which could lead some to say, and we're sort of circling back to something we've touched on, that Mary is the way forward. Jesus is such a contentious issue, right, for Christians and Muslims. Like, there's almost no agreement on Jesus. Well, that's not fair. Okay, there's some agreement. But
there's a polemical history. It's a long polemical history that tarnishes even our discussions today. I think that's part of the issue. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And of course, Muhammad is very complicated. Whether Christians give any status to Muhammad at all, and some have said Muhammad is a prophet, but still sort of part of the prophets who prepare the way for Christ somehow. Others have rejected his prophethood. Some very polemically reject his prophethood. So, I mean, some would say, then why not Mary? I mean, basically, Christians and Muslims, we've just spoken about all the ways that Mary is so elevated by the Qur'an, so why not look at Mary? I mean, I think we've covered most of this. You've noted that for Christians, actually Christians are all over the place on Mary, especially when you look at, you know, the large body of Protestant Christians, for the most of whom Mary is not very central to their way of thinking about spirituality. So I don't know if you want to look forward or maybe give us an assessment of your own feeling about whether Mary is more bridge or barrier. But what do you think of the claim that, I want to mention one more thing. I'm sorry, I'm going on too long. But I think you mentioned in your book that the Feast of the Annunciation, so March 25th, in Lebanon, is the one and only official Muslim/Christian holiday, a shared holiday. And that, I think, was an explicit effort at dialogue, right? So I don't know if you want to comment about that or say anything.
Yeah, and again, once again, my understanding is that it was a Muslim who had the idea. So I think that Muslims today, a lot of Muslims are really excited about the idea of Mary, even though, as we've already talked about it, in terms of Christians and ecumenism and feminism, maybe some Christians are like, well, I don't know about Mary. But I think Mary is still a good starting point, because I see in my classes that 19 and 20-year-olds are excited about this idea. They're very excited about this idea of Mary, because, you know, even if they would dismiss her as, well, she's not a role model for me, like some of the Christians, or I don't say the rosary, they know about her. She's so, you know, larger than life that, so I think that despite concerns about feminism and concerns about ecumenism, I think I've seen it. I've seen the potential in my classes. In my class, Shared Figures in the Bible and the Quran, people are always writing about Mary. They pick that topic again and again and again. So it is compelling. That's the first thing I would say. But I think there's one other barrier point that we didn't mention, that I do mention in my book that I like to mention now, and that is sort of Mary and triumphalism and Mary and violence and the history of that. And I think that we have to be aware, Christians and Muslims, of that history. And actually, I just read this, I just found out about this. There's an article in the Atlantic from a week ago that talks about the weaponization of the rosary by alt-right Catholic groups, like extremist groups. And some colleagues of mine were arguing, theologians were arguing, they're saying, hey, how can this article, you know, talk about this example of extremism? Is this Catholic bashing? And what? But my response to that is, well, there is actually a history, a strain within the Christian tradition of weaponizing, of militarizing Mary and of weaponizing the rosary. And the militarizing of Mary starts with very early Byzantine uses of Mary on the walls of Constantinople, and she's not only protecting against, you know, the heretics, the pagans, the Avars, the Russians, the Arabs, but she's also actually in battle. The Acathistos can see, like, Mary's fighting. Okay, so Mary is a general. This is transferred to medieval Spain, you know, the Christians, the Conquista against the Moors. Then we have Battle of Lepanto, 16th century. Our Lady of the Rosary is Our Lady of Victory against the Muslims. Then in the 19th century, we have Pope Leo XIII talking about the fight against the modernists, which is not, it's more intellectual and theological than physical. But then we've got fighting against the communists and fighting against Muslim terrorists. So it's Mary can be used and misused as a barrier between whoever the Christians who think they're correct and whoever the enemy is. And so I think that's at least something to be noted, that she hasn't always been this nice, lovely bridge. She's been co-opted.
Interesting. Yeah, really interesting and challenging. I wonder too, maybe just as a final point, I sometimes suspect, not only with Mary, but with other biblical figures in Islam, that Christians and maybe Jews, but at least Christians, have a way, especially with Mary and Jesus, of exaggerating their importance for Muslims, because it's probably not out of just, I don't know, prejudice, but mostly because they're more comfortable speaking about Mary and Jesus. So, I mean, I think, in fact, Muslim spiritual life is around the Qur'an and the Hadith, devotion to the Prophet Muhammad. These are the main figures. Spiritual reading would be from Qur'an, Hadith, life of the Prophet, life of the Sahaba, maybe of the Imams for Shiites. It wouldn't really be a focus on Mary. I mean, Mary would come up when you encounter her in the Quran. Yeah, I just wonder if it's necessarily a Christianizing move to say, hey, let's all gather around Mary, like happened in Lebanon.
Yes, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. That is a concern. However, Muslims are making the Christianizing move, like I said, in the billboard and whatever, because they realize, at least in the context, and again, context matters, right? So if you're in the United States of America and you are a Muslim minority who is concerned about Islamophobia and you want to build bridges, you're going to look for those.
Interesting.
Right? And so, so the Muslims themselves are doing it because they're saying, hey, we're trying to find some commonalities. Here is one. But you're right. Like if you go into places, and I've seen this, in places where Christians are the minority, they might say things like, the Quranic Mary, that's not my Mary. That's, because they don't see her as a bridge. So I think, I think context matters. So if Muslims are making the move, okay, but you're right. I mean, if you look at the bulk of the Islamic tradition, Mary and Jesus are small, and if Jesus figures, he usually figures in polemics.
Interesting.
So so that's important to keep in mind. Thank you for that.
All right. So finally, I just would love to give you an opportunity to speak about what you're doing now, what's up in the life of Professor George-Tvrtkovic, in terms of your research projects, new initiatives, and then also how can people stay in touch with your work?
Okay. What am I working on now? So right now I'm co-editing a volume for the Brill series, Companions to the Christian Tradition, which are like little handbooks for graduate students or undergraduates who are not historians, not theologians, but sort of to give them a broad view of things. And so the topic is the Brill Companion to Christian, Jewish, Muslim relations in the medieval Mediterranean. So I'm co-editing this, which is, co-editing something is a different project than producing it yourself, right? That's a different skill. So I'm working on that. One project that's recently emerged is, I think we're going to publish, I have a Muslim female scholar colleague and a Jewish female scholar colleague, and we have scheduled several lectures together at our universities. So, but then we're thinking about publishing that as like conversations between the three of us. Beautiful. So that's a project that's recently developed. It's going to happen at some point. And then the more research and history is, and this will take a while, but I'm interested in the history of the Dominican order, the Catholic Dominican order, as relationships with Muslims and how the Dominican order has impacted the Catholic theology of Islam over time. So that's a very ambitious project that I hope, let's just say I hope to finish that before I retire.
I wish we had a chance to speak about your book on Ricardo de Montecroce, who I think was a Dominican, right?
Absolutely, he would be absolutely part of that book, yes.
Yeah, and Thomas Aquinas has some challenging things to say about Islam, so there's a lot, another Dominican, of course.
And George Anawati, let me point out George Anawati, who was an Egyptian Dominican who was very influential in the writing of Nostra Aetate and Islam. So yeah, we go from the 13th century all the way to the 20th and 21st century with the Dominicans. So that's, but again, as you can imagine, that's a book project that will take me years and years and years, but the kernel is there.
May you have many productive years before you, and thank you so much, Rita, for spending some time with me. And I hope we can have another chance, a round two, to speak about some of your future projects. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.